Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Screen Chronicles. I'm Steve. With me, as always, is Buddy Cobstone. Today, we have a special guest on, Dr. Tom Birkett. He's a lecturer in Old English and Old Norse at University College Cork in Ireland. He's written books including Reading the Runes in Old English and Old Norse Poetry, as well as the Norse myths, stories of the Norse gods and heroes vividly retold, which is something we've talked about in a couple of our episodes. Thank you for coming on today, Dr. Tom Birkett.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited to talk about some of these things with you. And just to give you a little background, Steve and I really didn't know much about Norse mythology, the Viking Age, anything from the 8th century to, I guess, the 11th, 12th century. We didn't know much about it until we started watching a show called The Last Kingdom. And subsequently, we watched the show Vikings. And it really kind of, although those shows are based in historical figures and events, it really kind of made us go on our own research and try to learn more about it. So that's one reason we're really excited to talk to you today. But could you kind of start by just telling us a little bit about your background?
As you said, I'm the lecturer in Old English and Old Norse at University College Cork. I'm not from Ireland, as you can probably guess from my accent.
Yeah.
I've been here for about 8 years now in the university. And I think I got interested in the medieval period from a very early age, you know.
Oh, really?
I had no idea you could have a career in medieval stuff, you know. But then when I was studying at university, I just by chance ended up going to Norway for my year abroad, you know. And since then, I've just been very interested in the Vikings, in Norse culture generally, and my path kind of took me further and further in that direction. So it was partly by chance that I ended up so interested in the period. It's something that's really kind of come back into public consciousness, I think, particularly with shows like the Vikings, with Last Kingdom. The Vikings have always been popular, but at the moment, it seems everyone knows about them and has an opinion about them, and that's fantastic for me in the university, you know.
Absolutely.
What drew you to that Norse mythology and that Viking history?
I think apart from reading Lord of the Rings, you know, and I don't know if you know the Rosemary Sutcliffe novels for children. They're probably a bit dated now, but I kind of grew up
I'm
with
not sure.
Shield Wall and Dawn Wind and all that kind of thing. So I always had that interest. But I think when I started reading about the myths, you know, and reading about it's a very complicated period of history, but the myths, I think, are these fascinating, you know, rich, complicated stories that are just very difficult to kind of pin down morally and you know, in terms of contradictions and different sources and things. It just seemed like it would be a kind of endlessly fascinating period to study. And it's, we're finding new things there all the time as well. The sources are very old, but things are being dug up all the time, excavated. You know, we're learning more and more, and opinions about the period are changing. So it's just a fascinating time in history, I suppose.
Yeah, that's what we really like about those shows is the mythology and the culture that we get to see. And it really brings it in. It's almost like a whole different world when, you know, especially when we started watching The Last Kingdom, there was their culture, the Vikings, the Danes, we were just like, wow, that's different. That's just so different.
We couldn't believe some of the things that we saw in the show, and we were like, oh, that's great screenwriting. And then you go and you find out, wow, that actually happened. Alfred actually went to the Somerset Marshes, you know, and stories like that was amazing to find out was real. And one thing I really enjoy about this book that you wrote is that it's pretty comprehensive. Not only you get the myths, but you get a lot of history as well. So could you talk a little bit maybe about your approach to writing the book?
Well, I wanted to include some of those things that wouldn't really fall under the banner of mythology. Because I think they're all part of the kind of story world of these people, which I guess anyone who's reading the book is interested in. So, you know, the myths are amazing and colorful, you know, and great stories. But then some of the historical accounts, you know, of going to settle in Iceland, going across to, you know, to Greenland and starting a colony there in the most unlikely place, and, you know, traveling down the river routes to Constantinople, you know, and serving as the bodyguard to the Byzantine emperor. You know, these are true stories, and they're just as crazy as the mythology, really. So I wanted to kind of blend those two things in, and there's obviously a lot of legendary material as well, which is the story of Ragnar himself. That was such a good decision to base the Viking series around that figure, because he kind of marks the exact point really where legend and history meet. So he probably didn't exist, and he's a kind of, there are references to historical figures which may have been associated with him, but his sons certainly did, and they had a huge impact on the period. So yeah, he absolutely marks that meeting of legend and history. So that book is kind of planned in a way that it begins with the creation, and all the kind of big mythical narratives, and then I've tried to kind of slowly move into legend, and then finally to end with some of the real stories. And I think they're as entertaining as Thor with his hammer and Loki and Odin and all that kind of thing. So yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, the creation story that you mentioned in the book, from their history, their culture, it's so metal is how I would describe it. It's just
yeah.
There's this one god, he makes all the other gods, and then they kill him and make the whole world, and it's so crazy. And yeah, I guess that kind of influenced their habits and their culture, I guess, then too, that sort of mentality from their religion.
Yeah, I mean that there are 3 different stories about the creation, at least. There's the killing of the giant Ymir, using his body parts to make the world. Like that's a fantastic story. And if that was something that was believed widely across the Viking world, they must have had a very different relationship with the landscape. They were seeing trees and it was the bristles of Ymir's beard. They were seeing rocks and they were the bones of Ymir. But then there's another, in other sources, the gods Odin and his brothers kind of drag the world up from the ocean.
Okay.
So there are these, even that kind of what you'd imagine would be the one consistent thing about a mythology would be its beginning. There's different stories, and that was quite tricky, trying to bring those things together, and create a kind of coherent narrative from them. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me how believing in these stories or kind of understanding these stories in the way that they did would have given them a completely different mentality, I think, to a lot of the kind of other European peoples at the time, I suppose, who'd been Christianized for a long time in places like England and Francia and Spain. So one of the things I think is just the fact that Odin, particularly as their kind of head god, he's so interested, he's so curious about the world, and he's always trying to find out more. He's always trying to push the limits of what's possible. He's always doing things that the other gods don't approve of as well. And that includes getting dressed up as a woman and doing kind of magic that's prohibited by the gods. So he's always kind of pushing at those boundaries, and I think that explains a lot of the kind of the mentality of the people that we call the Vikings, who were going out and discovering new places and meeting new cultures and adapting very quickly to what they found. And I think what that mythology taught them to do was to be adaptable, and to be curious, and to be deceitful when it suited them as well. Odin is definitely not someone who has a good moral compass. But I suppose that was beneficial to them as well when they were fighting and settling in new places.
The morality of the gods is something that's really interesting to me. I feel like a lot of religions kind of look at the gods as the perfect idol to be, but a lot of these Norse gods are very fallible. And even, they think of Loki as being deceitful, but Odin, like you said, has a lot of stories of him being deceitful as well.
And Thor can be kind of a jerk sometimes.
And Thor can be,
he just bashes first and thinks about it afterwards. He's I always think of him as a kind of angry simpleton, really.
He's not like the cool Australian British Chris Hemsworth version of Thor, is he?
Not at all, no. But that's something that comes across very strongly, and it's something I tried to get in the book, I think, is that they had a different relationship with their gods. Like you said, they weren't putting them up on pedestals and saying, like, this is the being who everyone has to aspire to. They were kind of, Thor has a temper, Odin's deceitful. They're marrying each other's, they're intermarrying. There's incestuous relationships. Loki's, turning himself into a horse and another horse, and they're but I think at the same time as kind of humanizing them and not putting them on a pedestal, they were still, I suppose, respectful of the gods, and I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. And some interpretations of the gods, I think, have really gone down the path that they were to be feared, at all times, and they weren't to be made fun of. And any Norse myth that pokes fun at the gods was a late interpretation. It was Christians, making fun of the gods. And I don't buy that at all. I think they held them in awe, and you didn't want to anger Thor, and you wanted to sacrifice to him, and you wanted to, because he was powerful. But you could also laugh at him, just as you could laugh at your neighbor who had a bad temper, or you could laugh at people's faults and foibles and things. So they really humanized them, I think, and they wouldn't have been these figures up in the sky, that didn't have anything to do with humans. They'd have been walking amongst them, I suppose. You could see aspects of the gods in legendary figures, in the people that you admired in society. So I think, that's another thing that's fascinating, isn't it? That it's just such a different concept of deities and of
exactly.
And of the afterlife as well, of course, which is the polar opposite, really, to the Christian worldview.
And the fact that it seems like the gods are also subject to fate to a degree is kind of another thing that separates it from a lot of other religions.
Yeah, that's something that Odin's always struggling against, isn't it? He's constantly trying to change or find a different fate for the gods, and he can never find it because it's something that's beyond them. And I think it's interesting that it's the Norns, those women who weave out the fate, who kind of, they're the ones pulling the strings, and even the gods have to obey that kind of cosmic force. But that idea of not only is fate inexorable, it's going to lead to defeat. That's really different as well. So they weren't thinking about going to this paradise, afterlife. They weren't thinking about good winning over evil. Even those two concepts, I think, don't fit in properly with the battle between the gods and giants, because it's not clear who is good and who is evil in that kind of realistic sense. So they were preparing for this battle that they'd lose, and again, that must have filtered through into the risks they put themselves in battle, and how they were willing to sail out into the ocean, into nothingness, not knowing what was on the other side of it. And I suppose that was something that their concept of the afterlife was telling them to do as well, or teaching them to do.
I thought it was really interesting just how their afterlife, when I first started hearing about Valhalla and hell, I started sort of putting it towards like our dichotomy of the afterlife, or the Christian version of it, where it's good place where you get to be forever, bad place where you're there forever. But Valhalla is really just sort of like Odin's army for Ragnarok is what it kind of is, right? Is that what from what I understand?
Yeah. It's it doesn't sound like a very appealing afterlife to me. Like you go and you hack each other's limbs off in the day, and then you get sewn back together and you feast in the evenings. There's lots of drinking of beer and mead and things, and entertaining. But yeah, they're just in this kind of endless waiting room, where they're kind of practicing and doing these kind of dry runs for the final battle. And they're doing all that, and they're putting all that effort in, knowing that they're going to lose, I think Tolkien admired that he saw a kind of dignity in that. I think the kind of facing up to the chaos, or to the darkness, or to the monsters, whatever you want to call them, and kind of knowing you were going to lose, but still, that didn't excuse you from preparing and trying your best. But yeah, it's just a very alien concept, I think, to any kind of
modern Westerners. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just trying to wrap your head around like what people back then, what kind of universe they believed they were living in is I feel like it's kind of a tough thing to do for us.
Yeah, it's really hard to put ourselves in their shoes. I think, and we've got to be careful as well, because almost everything that's come down to us has been filtered through a Christian literary culture, you know. So things like the famous myth of Odin hanging himself from the world tree, you know, and piercing himself with a spear and getting the knowledge of the runes. That seems to be a really kind of central myth that Snorri, like the great mythographer of the medieval Iceland, you know, he doesn't mention that myth at all, perhaps because it was a little bit too associated with the kind of heathen practices, you know. Maybe there was some kind of sacrificing to Odin, hanging from trees, that kind of thing. But even that myth, which you'd think would be, you know, free from kind of influence of Christianity, there are such clear overlaps with the crucifixion narrative, you know, the piercing of the side with the spear, hanging, you know, and it's really difficult to prize these influences apart, I think, and to get to the kind of core of what we think was there before Christianity. And it's probably an impossible thing to do, but even so, the stories that have come down are so kind of rich and so different, that there was clearly some very different way of understanding the world going on, I think.
Why do you think that the sort of more modern Western Christianity won out over the Vikings and sort of took over their Norse mythology? Like, was it just because they were settling there, or what reasons were that, I guess?
Well, I think, I mean, there are lots of reasons, but I think it was only ever going to go one way, you know. The weight of Christian Europe, you know, the centers of kind of learning and culture and trade in Europe, and you know, that was the end of the Viking Age. Really came about because the Viking kingdoms became modern Christian European kingdoms, you know, and that pressure, that kind of relentless pressure to become part of this really powerful world to the south, you know, with all its trappings. Like, you can imagine the medieval Icelanders when the kind of missionaries came over with their incense and their, you know, their finery and their, you know, their bishops' mitres and, you know, all these kind of trappings, the richly decorated manuscripts, you know, the gold and the silver ornaments, you know, everything that was kind of associated with Christianity materially as well. I think that must have been a huge kind of draw. And like I said, I mean, I think also Norse mythology kind of, or Norse belief, if you can talk about that, I think it sowed the seeds of its own destruction in a way, because it was teaching them to be so adaptable, you know. And you get the feeling that if Odin had to become a Christian to get something he wanted, he'd have done it, you know. So I think it was priming them to let go of the old gods as well, if it suited their purposes. And for a lot of the Vikings, it suited their purposes very early on to become Christians, you know, to trade with England and France, like Rollo, you know, the character in the Vikings, but also a definite historical figure, started the dynasty of the Normans, you know, and within a generation, all these Vikings were speaking French and, you know, riding horse, you know, fighting on horseback, and, you know, they'd taken on all the culture, that they were Christianized, you know. So I think Norse myth allowed for kind of flexibility in a way that Christianity doesn't, because it's dogma, you know, and I mean, Christianity has the Bible behind it, you know, it has the religion of this codified book. And Norse myth didn't have that either, you know, it was a collection of stories. There wasn't a kind of Norse Bible to refer to it. And that means that in different parts of the Viking world, they would have had a different Thor, you know, they'd have had a different person they were worshipping. The stories would have differed. It was constantly changing, you know, and so, again, it made it more adaptable, I suppose, and more adaptable to being sucked into the Christian narrative as well. You know, there are those amazing stone crosses in the north of England, which are carved with scenes from the poetic Edda, you know, of Thor fighting with the Midgard serpent and Odin with the wolf, you know, and somehow they managed to bring those stories into Christianity as well. So yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer.
No,
Great.
Great
It's fascinating stuff. It's really fascinating stuff.
That's something, Colby, you always say is that they always seem more open-minded because they're polytheistic is how you've sort of interpreted.
At least in the show, the way they're depicted in the shows, you know, obviously, I mean, you've seen Vikings, you've seen that, like, I think Rollo in season 1 or 2, maybe it was 2, decides, yeah, you can baptize me to get what they want. And later on, even Ragnar, like, converts to get what he wants at the time. And a thing in The Last Kingdom that I noticed too is that a lot of the Danes in that show, when they kind of are looking at the Christians, they're kind of looking at a different entity. Not that it doesn't exist. They're just kind of fighting against this different entity compared to the Christians who are looking at all their gods like, oh, they're not even real. You know, they're just false beliefs, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Concept.
And yeah, I mean, I think that's something that both shows, particularly Vikings, I think that they get right. You know, the Ragnar is very interested. You know, his name's Aethelstan, isn't it? He's kind of his way into learning about Christianity. You know, and I think I think the way they do that is quite believable. You know, so he's not abandoning his gods. You know, and you know, he's not desperate to become a Christian, but he's curious and he's always asking for more knowledge, and he's always, you know, you always feel he's kind of teetering between the two worlds, and he kind of knows that Christianity has the weight of culture behind it, you know, and that it's perhaps inevitable that they're all going to become Christian eventually, even though characters like Floki are very resistant to that idea, as there would have been in. But you know, I mean, the leader of the great army, Guthrum, you know, he was baptized as part of the peace settlement with Alfred the Great, you know, and Alfred sponsored him at his baptism, you know, and so that was a way of kind of Alfred telling him, like, you're coming into the fold now, you know, and like whether that changed their behaviors and attitudes quickly, I doubt it very much, you know, but I think that this idea that the Vikings would rather have, you know, they'd have rather death than conversion to Christianity is rubbish. You know, so many of them just took it because it was convenient, you know. And,
Absolutely. So some other thing that's interesting is, I think it's Snorri Sturluson is his name, right?
Yeah.
Who wrote the Edda, right? But he had converted to Christianity. Is that correct?
Well, the whole society being Christian
had been Christian.
Yeah, for over 200 years, 250
By
years.
the point he wrote that.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah. So why do you think, does it surprise you that he ended up writing these Norse beliefs in a book?
Well, I think in Iceland they were so kind of in touch with their history, and poetry, stories of their ancestors, you know, were so important to them. And you couldn't compose Norse poetry without making reference to those old body of stories. You know, you couldn't quote an old poet without making reference to the myth, you know. So I think he was very much interested in preserving the mythology in order to preserve the literary tradition that he saw himself as being part of.
Interesting.
So I think in Iceland they weren't so quick to let go of the old stories, I think, because it just had this additional. Icelanders were very proud of their literary tradition and of going to other countries and kind of serving as the court poet, you know, for a powerful Norwegian earl or for the king or for. Yeah. So that was really part of their identity, was bound up with poetry, with the sagas, with the settlement history. So yeah, I mean, it's surprising in a way that this stuff survived for that long, you know, against all the pressure of Christianity, but in other ways it's not that surprising, you know, because I think the stories, like, we appreciate them today, you know, the stories are good stories, and you don't let go of a good story, you know, if you
exactly.
if you can help it. So yeah, but he's an amazing figure, Snorri. Like he's wheeler dealing, getting involved in politics, and supporting the Norwegian crown against Iceland, and he's getting, he had a finger in every pie, and at the same time he was, writing these treatises on poetry and collecting together the mythology, and he's responsible for most of the kind of codified stories that have come down to us, so he's a hugely important figure.
Yeah. And a lot of those stories that he wrote about, I think, they went back and they find like runes or even just like pictures back in Scandinavia, correct? And in like England too, that supplement and kind of confirm some of those stories that might have been their beliefs.
Yeah. So there aren't many myths that are kind of represented clearly, but there are a few, and one of them is the fishing of the whale serpent by Thor. And Snorri got the details of that down to the attaching of an ox head as the bait, to the hook. And Thor pulls so hard that his foot goes through the bottom of the planks in the boat, And then you find there are carvings from the Viking Age itself, from some 400 years previously, with Thor's foot poking through the boat and an ox head on the end of the line. So those kinds of things really give us faith that a lot of what he was retelling was authentic. But what we don't know is how much he massaged the stories, to tell them in a kind of logical way and to, make them a little bit more palatable to a Christian society, and putting order on them. Like that's the other thing about the kind of cultural weight of Christianity, is it's got that order associated with it. It's got the very set narrative of the creation, and the central narrative of Christ, and the second coming, and heaven, and it's all written down, and it's all the same in whatever Christian country you'd find in medieval Europe. And Norse myth didn't have that, and you have to wonder whether Snorri wasn't influenced by that kind of linear narrative of Christian history, and he was trying to replicate that with his retelling of the myths. So I think most kind of scholars of Old Norse would probably see Snorri's main kind of influence with the Norse myths is putting it into that linear kind of story, where you kind of move from A to B, where there's a kind of a clear history, a clear progression of the stories, which that might not have existed, and it might not have been needed. You can have all these stories washing around, and they can be contradictory, and it doesn't matter, if it's not a kind of linear history.
That did make it kind of difficult for us, though, when we're trying to look up the mythology, when we're talking about the shows. It was just like, oh, well, this story, it's told this way. That's one reason I really like this, is just because it is kind of, I guess, a logical progression, but it has kind of everything put in. So even if you're like, oh, they called Aslog this in one reading I found on the internet, or they called her this in another one, it's all kind of there, and it all kind of makes you understand why.
I tried to be comprehensive, but of course, I mean, it's going a lot further than Snorri in kind of in pulling together things that, details from narratives that were told in different parts of Europe, and centuries apart, and things. I took a lot of liberties with that. But the one thing I didn't want to do was to add anything in, that didn't have a precedent in the medieval sources, which you have to be careful, because there are these gaps, and it's really tempting to fill them, because, I guess we're kind of so used to having stories that follow a linear progression and don't have holes in them, that you kind of, the temptation is always to fill in the details. And I think Tolkien a lot of his projects, things like The Hobbit, I think that was an attempt to fill in, details of the Sigurd legend, and his, coming to terms with this literature that he was studying as well, and teaching. He was really interested in those missing parts of the Poetic Edda, for example.
Yeah.
And he even rewrote the poems that were lost, in this kind of really curious, very archaic English style. But yeah, I mean, he was a creator. He wanted to add to what was already there.
So interesting.
I think, yeah, in this much more modest project, I just wanted to kind of gather things together to make them make sense, I suppose, because it can be very confusing to have all these contradictions and to have, different sources and so much detail, which is part of the joy of the myths, but it's difficult to get a handle on it sometimes for a kind of general reader, I suppose.
Well, didn't even Saxons, didn't they believe the same sort of faith before the Norsemen came, or before they converted to Christianity? That's where I get kind of fuzzy there.
Yeah, well, I think you're not the only one. I think everyone, we don't know very much at all about what the Anglo-Saxons or the early English believed. They had deities like Odin, who was probably very similar to Odin, but really there's no evidence, which is why Iceland is such a curiosity, I suppose, because in England, nothing except things like the days of the week taking the gods' names, that is a preservation, but none of the stories survived, or very, very few of them. And of course, that's what fascinated Tolkien as well. He wanted to kind of write the mythology for England that didn't exist,
I don't think people generally understand the not only Norse myth, but the Viking culture, how far it reached and how its fingerprints, how far it's gone, and even down generations, how things have been affected. I mean, and just kind of a small example of that, as we're talking about Tolkien right now, is I feel like there's so many things that Steve and I might read or watch that we're like, well, this was definitely influenced by Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. And then reading your book and doing other research on Norse myths, it's like, well, thinking the same thing about Tolkien, like, well, this is definitely where he got his influence. So it's kind of cool to see how far back these kind of influences go.
Tolkien, I say to my students, he was the greatest plagiarist of all time. But he had a precedent, because he knew that. I mean, one thing about, we've talked about Snorri, but almost all the Eddic poetry, almost all the sagas that survived, they're all anonymous, and there wasn't that same concept of one author having ownership over a work, or putting their name to a work. It was a kind of collective literature, I suppose. So Tolkien understood that, and that gave him license to borrow and rework and do whatever he wanted without having to cite anyone,
Didn't have to pay Disney enough or anything.
I find it fascinating. Yeah. No, he always kind of denied, with a bit of a glint in his eye, I think he denied having sources, and he said, I think in his essay on fairy stories, he said, don't go poking around in the soup to try and find the bones of the animal, that made the soup. Like, what's the point of that? So he was always trying to tell people to back off from looking at the sources, But I think it's really interesting for people who are into Tolkien to understand where he was getting his influences from. And when you see stuff like, you read the story about the cursed gold, and the ring that's paid as a ransom,
right.
And that caused this figure Fafnir to turn into a dragon who took all the gold away and hid away from people jealously, and like, you can almost hear, when you read that now, you can almost hear my precious,
Precious, yeah.
I mean, he was really basing, particularly The Hobbit, I think, very, very, very closely on these medieval precedents, and Beowulf, of course, had a huge impact as well. But, yeah,
that is a good example, of the of that ring, and it kind of, however it passed on, it seemed to have this kind of curse with it. That is very interesting.
And he was doing something very different to Wagner, who'd slightly before Tolkien's time, was created the ring cycle, and the desire for the ring was all about this desire for power, to have power over other people. And for Tolkien, he kind of turned that on his head, and the ring had this corrupting effect on people, which he saw in the Norse sources. But then his heroes are the ones who can resist that power.
Absolutely.
So he's not only kind of repeating or taking influence from the stories. I think he's really trying to work through the morality of the stories and to kind of sometimes turn things on their head as well. Like Frodo, his name kind of is related to peace, and to a king who's mentioned in the sources for a period of peace. And there's nothing really more said about him apart from the fact that it was so peaceful during his reign that you could leave a gold ring on a heath and no one would pick it up, And again, you can kind of see how that just would have sparked off an interest, and why haven't stories survived about this peaceful king?
Why isn't that idolized?
So and then for Tolkien, his immediate thought was how can I kind of write that back in through my fiction, I suppose.
That's interesting. And at the end of the book, you do talk quite a bit about kind of how Norse myth has impacted Germany, kind of in Nazi Germany even. I don't know if you could kind of talk to that a little bit too.
Well, I suppose it was kind of bound up with romantic nationalism to begin with, of kind of Scandinavian countries initially being very interested in their early history and, trying to basically use Iceland and all the sources that had survived in Iceland to kind of understand their roots and their early beginnings, but then this more problematic kind of branch of romantic nationalism in Germany was trying to I suppose see Icelandic material as being evidence of a Germanic culture, a kind of pan-Germanic culture, which had been erased by Christianity, and so Germany could see its ancient roots in Norse myth and legend, and what they read out of that was the need for violence, the need for power over other people, for all the kinds of things that you can read into the myths if you want to read into the myths, but of course it's ignoring that huge complexity, which, like, I don't think there's a single Norse myth that says something straightforward, even when it seems like it's a straightforward statement of morality or belief. There's always something that undercuts it, that problematizes it, that kind of, and it wasn't just in 1930s Germany that kind of misreading was happening. Like it's happening still, and in more recent, the legacy is still ongoing of that kind of misreading of the sources. But obviously, in 1930s Germany, it got so implicated in the Third Reich and in Germany. The idea that Germany was going to rise from the ashes, and reclaim its heroic heritage and all that kind of thing. And nobody was consulting the Icelanders about this, and it was just a complete misuse of a heritage which belonged to Iceland if it belonged to anyone,
I wasn't even aware of that until I read it in your book. I wasn't aware of that from history.
Yeah, and I think, it had a big impact on the study of Norse culture, I suppose, for a long time, because of course it was bound up with the Nazis and with with that misappropriation, and thankfully that's not what people think of now when you mention Thor or you mention I think ultimately Tolkien's legacy is the greater one,
which is awesome,
which is great and a relief, but there's still a big shadow that hangs over the discipline, I think, and it's why I think you have to be very careful when you read them, not to fall into the traps that we're falling into.
And there's so many myths and religions that you could misinterpret wrong, and you see it in a lot of different other religions as well. Things being misinterpreted and even into violent ways. Almost anything, but
really anything, I guess, could be taken that way.
Yeah, it was just something interesting that we never thought about when we learn about Nazi Germany in the U.S., we don't talk about Norse mythology or its influence on anything really. We don't talk about Norse mythology really at all here.
Yeah.
It's so that's kind of one thing we're really glad the show is kind of just to learn about the history of these things.
And the show is really clever with the way it uses mythology, I think, in particular. I mean, there are faults with the show, I think, but it gets a lot of things right. And I think that they put in a lot of the myth and they put in a lot of the poetry, in fact, without making a big deal about it. It's just kind of woven into the plot. And I think that's exactly how it should be represented. It wasn't like, right now we're going to tell a story, and this is the story of Thor's fight with the Midgard serpent. It was just something that was part of their worldview and that was kind of tripping off their tongues and influencing the way they moved in the world. But I think they treated that with real sensitivity in the Vikings show, and it's really effective. I like the scene where they're trying to explain Ragnarok to Aethelflead, and it's like a kind of Amdram production, of what they would have thought Ragnarok was about, with all those kinds of gestures, with that storytelling, with the space, the smoke in the room and the disorientation, and I think that's a really effective way of showing how these stories might have worked, and we just don't know how they would have been performed originally. But
what do you think about that seer? What do you think about the seer?
That's a bit weird. I don't know where the whole licking the hand comes from. And,
okay, I didn't know if that was like a real thing.
And I think, I don't know why they didn't make it a woman for a start, because women are associated with fate. They're associated with the Valkyries, obviously, but also with prophecy. So there are these women called the vulva or the seeresses. Odin goes to a seeress to tell him about the history of the world. So they always seem to have been the ones with the longest memories and the greatest knowledge. So I don't know why they didn't take that opportunity, because they're very good at putting strong female characters into Vikings, but that seemed to be a misstep for me. I don't know why he was a man. And the whole, the whole stuff with Uppsala, and the kind of sacrifices, and like that's all a bit, there are temples, which is really, there's no historical evidence for at all. And it seems more like a kind of organized religion. So I don't think that was as effective, but in other places where they just kind of, I'm trying to remember exactly the plot of some of the Vikings episodes I've seen, but there's one where a guy called Harbard, right, comes to Kattegat.
Yes, all the men are away, and so he's hooking up on everyone.
And that's one of the names for Odin, and he's in disguise as Harbard, and so that's never kind of made explicit, that he's a kind of Odin figure. But I suppose people will then go and kind of look him up, and they'll come to that story. And I think that again was a very effective kind of storyline of this stranger just arriving. Nobody knows who he is, and that's how Odin liked to move around the world as well, in disguise and causing trouble. And
I wish it would have
people
had some sort of more acknowledgement of it, I guess, because he just kind of came, some weird stuff happened, and you never saw him again. And then Odin does show up when Ragnar dies to tell all of his sons, but he's the old Odin, and he's missing the eye. He's got the raven.
Yeah. Typical, the Gandalf
Odin.
But then I suppose that is quite true to the sources. Odin does just turn up and disappear, and he doesn't. I mean, there's one story where he gets roasted on a spit, until he reveals who he is.
Right.
And he's always getting into these riddle contests, where the loser will lose their neck, will lose their head, He likes to have very high stakes in everything he does. But yeah, he appears and he disappears at will, and he kind of changes allegiances, like even halfway through a battle, switching sides or deciding he doesn't support this person anymore, and they die, And so I think almost as much as Loki, he's a figure you wouldn't put a lot of faith in,
Yeah. For a guy you call Allfather, he's pretty shifty.
Yeah. But then the Allfather thing and the prominence of Odin could well be a Christian influence as well, of the need to have one deity above the rest.
That's interesting that we don't think about maybe how that Christian influence, you've talked a lot about it today, about how that Christian influence kind of filtered it to how we perceive these stories. So that's an interesting thing we need to think about.
Yeah.
But then there are stories as well, which, you wonder how they did survive into the Christian period, these really outrageous tales. And, I think one of my favorites is probably the Master Builder story, which tells you a lot of what you need to know about Norse myth, really, including how crazy it is sometimes. But the very idea that, so the story is about, you know it obviously, but
feel free, yeah.
It's about a mysterious builder who turns up, which is quite an Odin move in itself. He turns up unannounced, and he says to the gods, "I can build a wall to protect Asgard, to protect your home, and I want you to give me Freya, and to give me the sun and the moon as payment." And the gods kind of get together, and in typical, immoral style, they say, "Well, we're not going to give him this reward, but we'll get him to do the work anyway," and they agree to the deal, thinking that it's impossible, but he has a horse who helps him, and the wall is almost completed, and Asgard is almost surrounded. And then the gods panic and they blame Loki, as they usually do. And Loki has to come up with a plan, and he turns himself into a mare, and he leads away the stallion, and months later a stallion with 8 legs is born, which becomes Odin's horse. And the gods break their vows, to prevent a disaster, to prevent losing the sun and the moon and Freya. But they are the ones who behave badly in that story. And I think the fact that the wall is never completed, that there's always a gap in the wall, that's really characteristic of Norse myth as well. And the gods always trying to do things, but never quite managing to perfect whatever it is they're trying. There's always a kind of chink in their armor, a flaw in their plan, and I just think that story has got so many levels to it, so much depth to it.
Yeah.
And,
you can definitely see where the show Vikings got a lot of its influence on how the plots are and stuff. Because for me, when I first started watching, we started watching it after The Last Kingdom, but Vikings was so much different. You would see myth happening right in front of them, and plus two, there was just a lot more betrayals and tricking and flipping sides in that. And to me, I was just like, wow, were these people really like this? Why are they like this all the time? But then after reading these stories, it's like, wow, that's just these were their myths. So yeah,
that's the way they did it. And Sigurd was the greatest hero that ever lived. And his great battle was to kill a dragon by hiding in a pit, and stabbing it in the stomach. Like it's not the kind of typical heroic story. Like
totally.
But that's kind of what I suppose what was valued was not, we always think of the Vikings running headlong into battle, but they used guile, I think, as much as they used strength of arms.
It's an interesting example too, because I think, he's tricking the dragon, but wasn't his father-in-law? I think it was his father-in-law or something was trying to trick him too, and maybe he'd die when he stabbed the dragon, right? And then Odin helped him, right?
Father Reagan, and he drinks some dragon blood, and the birds tell him that Reagan is trying to trick him, and so he kills his foster father, you know, without a moment's hesitation. So yeah, they're all tricky characters, and they're not the kind of heroes that you'd find elsewhere in medieval literature. You know, the kind of Arthurian heroes with their strict code of honor, or you know, and they seem to have valued that in some of the stories, you know, about, I think in Vikings, in the Siege of Paris, they had that trick where Ragnar pretends to be dead in a coffin, you know.
Yeah.
Some historical basis for that, not associated with Ragnar, but
we've heard Heston, right? That's what.
Yeah, I think so. And the cat and mouse they played in England as well, with you know, the English would kind of gather together an army and go to face the Vikings, and then the Vikings would sail off and attack somewhere else, you know. And they weren't these kinds of they weren't rushing to their deaths, you know, to take their place in Valhalla. They were using every trick up their sleeve, you know, to try and survive another day, you know, and to win through whatever means it took.
Both shows put a real emphasis on the Danes, the Vikings, whatever vernacular they want to use, getting to Valhalla, though. And we see in the first season of Last Kingdom, you probably saw this as well, is one of the big things, I guess, for them, they had to hold the weapon as they died to go to Valhalla. And then, but I guess Vikings, sometimes they show there's different ways. It's just as long as you die, like in a more honorable way. I'm thinking like the first episode of the first season, it's even the guy who is a thief, he just has to get his head cut off the right way or something.
Yeah.
Like what all went into, I guess, getting to Valhalla? What do you know of that?
Well, I think that there are a few things we can go on. It's not entirely clear, but you didn't have to die with a sword in your hand in the heat of battle. You know, that there's a famous Viking, Haakon the Good, you know, king of Norway. He died from you know, a wound that went septic after the battle. And there's a poem written about him being invited into Valhalla by the Valkyries, you know, and the greatest warrior that's ever come to Valhalla is entering, you know. And I think that idea of actually having to die in the heat of battle probably wasn't the only way into Valhalla. But I suppose hell is reserved for people who die of sickness or old age, you know. And it's gods also go there, you know. Balder, Odin's son, and the greatest, you know, the most shining god, you know, the most kind of perfect god in a way. He goes to hell because he's killed by his brother. But yeah, I think it's very hard to tell exactly what gave you license to go into Valhalla, but I think it had to be a death you'd faced head on, you know.
Interesting.
But yeah, I don't know. Maybe the sword in the hand thing isn't a bad interpretation.
Well, the way they do it too is it's not even if you die in battle necessarily. If you die in bed, and as long as you got like a sword or an axe on hand, then you're good. You're safe then.
Yeah, maybe. They make a lot in Vikings, don't they? Of that in the first series, of that old guy who begs Ragnar to come on the trip with him because he wants to die in battle. And not But yeah, I mean, the Vikings, I think it's worth remembering that the Vikings were just a small segment of Norse society, you know. And yeah, maybe every Viking desired to get to Valhalla, but you know, every Norse person, I'm not so sure, you know. And I don't think there was always the opportunity to die in battle either, you know, as much as they went out raiding and put themselves in harm's way. If you were a farmer in Norway, you probably lived a relatively peaceful life, you know.
Yeah, that is interesting. There's one thing, just a kind of a small thing I saw in the book where Siggy killed a slave, and then like the next line says something like, "But he didn't announce it, so it was murder." I was wondering if you could talk about what that meant, or what their law was, or how that might have.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not, my knowledge of this is a bit hazy, but I know that you you were supposed to, in Iceland and in the Icelandic law codes, you were supposed to announce a death, and you could only go a certain number of farms, before it became murder if you hadn't announced it.
So that was in Vikings as well. Yeah. Like you went 3 houses. You could only go 2 before you could not tell someone.
Yeah, well, that someone's read that.
That's interesting.
Law code there. That's interesting because I suppose the idea of murder was bound up with not taking responsibility for it, But then a lot of heroes in Iceland, like Grettir the Strong, who he killed a teenager when he was a teenager, over a bag of food, and he didn't claim responsibility for it, and then he was exiled. So the heroes, the gods never live up to some moral standard, but the heroes as well, most often they have a really inauspicious beginning. They, like Grettir is cantankerous and, assaults his father and flays the skin off the back of a horse, for animal cruelty for no reason. And he's a really obnoxious character. I don't really know where I'm going with that.
Oh, but yeah.
No.
It's just so interesting.
Yeah.
With how their law might have been. Just if you say, I killed this guy. All right.
Yeah, could you just go around murdering people, I guess, if you just, as long as you reported it though?
Well, I think that it was more about the penalty that would be applied,
Right.
I think the thing is as well is that the Vikings are often depicted as being these kinds of lawless barbarians, who lived by the law of the sword kind of thing, and that couldn't be further from the truth. It was the legal system was highly developed, and in Iceland particularly, they didn't have a centralized government or authority figure like a king or judiciary. The thing that held that society together was law, and so there were. It was a very complex legal system with different punishments to match different crimes, and there were different levels of outlawry. You could, if it was lesser outlawry, you had to go away for 3 years and then you could come back. But if you got a higher level of outlawry, you had to leave forever. No one was allowed to help you. So you had to kind of sneak into a ship and try and escape the country. And and then there were different penalties for helping an outlaw and for. So it was it was the kind of the web that held the fabric of society together, I suppose. So
later seasons of Vikings seem like it's more anarchy. You can just kill whoever, whenever. There's no penalty. But they start out though, like, oh, here's some laws and here's that. But yeah, later on, I think that's where a lot of people get that impression too, is maybe just from that media.
Yeah, and the Dane law, which when you think about what that word means, it's the place where the laws of the Danes applied in England. So it wasn't this lawless place like the Wild West. It was just that was the law of that the Vikings held, which was different to Anglo-Saxon law.
Absolutely.
So a very kind of, and I think that. Also, that idea of I know you talked to somebody about one of the directors of Last Kingdom about sailing on the Viking ship.
And we wanted to ask you about that as well, since we see that that's a hobby of yours.
Yeah, I've been with them a few summers, and it's a great experience. Like if you get a chance to go on board a Viking ship, I'd recommend it for sure. And if there's any way to get a bit closer to understanding what it was like to be, what they felt, sleeping in those cramped quarters, and feeling really vulnerable in the middle of the ocean. But to sail a Viking ship with that many people in such close proximity, all working together, pulling the right rope at the right time and all rowing together and all, again, that idea of the Vikings being these kinds of brutes, who were burying axes in each other's heads at the slightest insult, and the complete anarchy reigning. You wouldn't be able to sail a Viking ship under those circumstances. So I think, in fact, they were probably very highly regimented, you know, and I suppose the organization and the discipline of working in those small units on board a Viking ship would have translated into how they were fighting on the battlefield, you know, in very, very close-knit groups, you know, used to working together, used to following orders and commands, and probably being very closely connected in terms of the place you grew up and the kin ties and all those kinds of things. So I think that is what made them into such a formidable fighting force, you know, as much as this kind of reckless abandonment to death and to race towards Valhalla, you know.
Oh yeah.
When you are on the Viking ship, though, where do you go raiding at? Like, where's
You go and raid the ice cream from various picturesque
that sounds like my kind of raid.
That's a good raid. Yeah. No, they often kind of tie it in with medieval fairs and that kind of thing happening around Denmark and Sweden. But they do quite a lot of kind of research as well. I mean, it's the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde that's reproduced this ship using the authentic tools, you know, the authentic materials, doing everything down to the, you know, down to using pine tar that they've made themselves, you know, and all the paint even is made in the traditional way. So they're kind of living museums, you know, and ways of testing how the technology worked, you know, and how do you sail one of these things? Like we can reconstruct it, but how did it work? You know, so the whole time you're testing out, refining the sailing capabilities of the ship, you know. And one of the things that it opened my mind to was that idea of how necessary it is for 70 people to work absolutely in tandem, you know.
It's incredible.
So that would have translated into the battlefield, you know, and the shield wall and
so that's another thing, is the shield wall is something that's depicted in you know, both shows we've watched. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about what the shield wall is all about? Yeah,
well, the shield wall is it wasn't just the Vikings, you know, it was the kind of standard operating procedure really, certainly in England as well. I can see why they've made it a Viking thing, you know, because they need some kind of shortcut to showing how the Vikings were such a formidable fighting force, you know. But really that was, you know, you linked shields with the person next to you, and you braced against the opposing shield wall, you know, and tried to cut through and make a gap and break the wall. But I think it would have involved a lot of pushing and shoving and hacking and, you know, the most kind of gruesome close quarter fighting you can imagine. And I think they do that quite well in The Last Kingdom, from what I remember in the first series. They really show that, you know, just how close that fighting was, you know, and how necessary it was for everyone to be working in unison as well, you know, because if somebody turns tail and runs, the shield wall breaks and, you know, the battle is lost. Like it was, and in some cases, certainly there were these groups of Vikings who were used to working really closely together, and the Anglo-Saxon Fyrd, you know, who were essentially farmers who've been gathered from the local area and you know, took down the ancestral weapon and were kind of put into some order, and then had to face these professional soldiers, or, you know, professional fighters in the summertime anyway. So yeah, I think the depiction of the shield wall in Last Kingdom is good. In the Vikings, there's I have a bit of a problem with how the English or the Anglo-Saxons are represented, because I think to draw some kind of distinction between the cultures, they've made the costumes very different, you know, and they've made the shields very different. And, you know, the Anglo-Saxons are wearing uniforms. You know, they've been supplied with identikit helmets, and, you know, they're all wearing the same color, and they're all, and I think other than having different haircuts, you know, they would have looked pretty similar, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I think you make a good point about how when the Vikings come over, these are all warriors that are coming over and like fighting farmers a lot of the time, sometimes back then. And I think the Last Kingdom books kind of talk about that a lot. But was there anything else that like the Vikings that made them formidable when they kind of came to England?
Well, I think, I mean, the Vikings were farmers as well, a lot of them,
Yeah.
They were just going on a Viking was going raiding in the summer, it was something you did to supplement your income, I suppose, in modern terms. But yeah, they wouldn't necessarily have been professional soldiers, but they would have been used to fighting together, and to certainly, certainly they would have been formidable opponents for Anglo-Saxon farmers, who'd been kind of gathered together. There were professional soldiers in England as well, the huscarls, the kind of professional group of people around the earl or around the king, so I suppose a lot of the battles would have had these kind of semi-professional soldiers, very well armed, but then also a lot of farmers who were poorly armed, and they probably wouldn't have been put at the center of things, at the center of the shield wall, but what made the Vikings so formidable? I mean, the ships was a huge thing, right? There was nothing. I mean, the English caught up, particularly with Alfred the Great and his successors. They caught up with the ship technology, but for a long time, Viking ships were, superior to anything else that was on the seas, and they had very shallow keels, so they could go up shallow rivers. They could beach the boats. So they were very, very mobile. They could be rowed, they could be sailed. They could take a lot of hits as well. But I think that mobility is really something that made the Vikings so formidable, because they could, if they didn't like the odds of a battle, they could get on the ships and they could sail out of the estuary and they could be somewhere else in England by the next day, and then what do you do with a land-based army then that takes 3 days to march somewhere that the Vikings could get in in half a day? Like it's, I think that was a problem for all the kings in England, including Alfred, was trying to pin the Vikings down to a pitched battle often, and again, that slightly goes against the assumption we have about the Vikings, any sniff of a battle, like they'd be howling, and running off to go and fight. But no, if they didn't like their chances, they'd leave. And I think they were probably quite precious about their ships as well, They were incredibly, I suppose, expensive in modern terms. Huge resources went in often quite poor areas in marginal farming land, in Norway, to gathering together all the resources needed to create this fantastic ship. And you wouldn't risk that ship again in a kind of confrontation that could end up with you having no way to leave this hostile land you'd entered, and no means of escape, and losing that investment you put in as well. So I think the Vikings probably sailed away more often than they engaged in battle.
That is interesting. And are a lot of the archaeological digs, don't they find like ships were part of burial sites and things like that too?
Yeah, so the ship burials, I mean, there were both people buried in ships, clearly as a sign of status, but maybe also as a sign of some kind of means of transitioning to the afterlife. The ship as a kind of metaphor, I suppose, for passing over. But you find, in Sweden there are some fantastic ship settings, like stone, not stone circles, but stones in the shape of a ship. And that seems to have served the same function, even though there was no actual ship buried there, they were still signaling some kind of progress to the afterlife, So the ship meant so many different things on so many different levels to that culture. I think it was probably the most important bit of technology, most important symbol of that culture, really.
But so we just kind of brought up Alfred a little bit too, who is a main central figure of the Last Kingdom. I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about who this guy was, because we had never heard of Alfred the Great. And after hearing about some of the things that he did, I feel like he should be talked about a lot. And his daughter Aethelflead and his son Edward, they were also just so influential in that time, in their interactions with the Danes and the Vikings. And is that something you like would have learned about in school growing up, or?
No, I would have first come across that at university, I suppose. He's such a central figure to that period, you know, and it's difficult to kind of underplay his achievements, really. I think a lot of, I mean, he had a great propaganda machine as well, particularly in his biographer Asa, who you know, wrote his life shortly afterwards, and certainly portrayed him in a very good light, perhaps at the expense of his brothers, you know, and his father, who were perhaps as successful as rulers. But no, I mean, he was thrust into these circumstances, you know, where the Viking threat had just escalated and you know, he found himself in the last independent kingdom in England, and he was fighting for the survival of Wessex, I suppose, and that's probably him hiding in the marshes. You know, there's definitely some truth to that, but how much of that is you know, Asa kind of embellishing the dire situation? But certainly, you know, it was an existential threat, the Viking, the great heathen army, and he not only kind of successfully repelled that threat, you know, and secured Wessex as a surviving kingdom, but then he was very interested, and that's where I kind of admire his legacy the most, I suppose, is he tried to instigate a kind of reformation in the culture and the language and the literature. He may not have been translating himself, but he certainly oversaw a process of translating Latin works into Old English, because he said, you know, learning has decayed to such a degree in England that there are no longer clergymen who can understand Latin, you know, in Wessex, because of the Viking raids, you know, and the trials and tribulations of the kingdom. So he not only kind of militarily secured the kingdom, but he really pushed a cultural renaissance, I suppose, particularly in the writing of English for the first time seriously. He oversaw the legal code. You know, he instigated a series of fortified towns around his kingdom. He, you know, some people talk about him as being the founder of the navy, but I don't think that's quite true. But certainly he was a state builder. You know, he wasn't content just with seeing off the Vikings and you know, securing his lot. He really had much greater ambitions, I think. I think he probably modeled himself. He went to Rome as a child, and he stayed with his father in the court of the Franks, you know, and he probably modeled himself on you know, those Christian kingdoms in Europe, the Christian kings in Europe, and also on the kind of the Old Testament kings like Solomon, I suppose. But I think something in the Last Kingdom that they pick up on, which is really good, again, I think is his medical issues, his frailty,
his bowel disease.
And I know some stuff has been written trying to identify exactly what he had, you know, like Crohn's disease or some other ailment that kind of bothered him for his whole life. I think that's another really interesting facet of this character. You know, he's seeing off the Vikings. He's translating difficult Latin texts into Old English. You know, he's reforming everything around him at the same time as dealing with this, what sounds like a very serious illness. You know, that he could only kind of eat gruel and couldn't stomach anything else. And he was extremely devout as well. They perhaps overplay that a little bit in the Last Kingdom. you know, he was as much a warrior king as a kind of, I think they portray him as a bit of a clergyman, don't they? That's kind of had kingship thrust upon him, maybe. But he may well have been have never been intended for the throne. You know, he was the youngest of a large number of brothers, and he, you know, it's possible he was intended to go into holy orders, you know, and to, there's stories about him being given a book of poems by his mother, you know, when he was very young, and he had to kind of learn them off by heart. And he would, I mean, again, that's his biographer trying to portray him in a certain way, but he was very interested in learning and in the arts, as well as in the kind of practicalities of running a kingdom and seeing off the Vikings. So yeah, an extraordinary figure, I think, and it's great that he comes up in the Vikings, doesn't he? I haven't seen.
Yeah, he does.
He does.
But they have two different stories of how he kind of comes into power. In Last Kingdom, it's because his brother was killed in battle, and that Ethelwald, the son of Aethelred, was not fit to be king. But in Vikings, I think that it's just kind of like a political, like family thing.
Kills him.
Or Judith would rather have him be king.
Oh my gosh, I hate Judith.
Yeah, well, yeah. They both you know, treat history with a bit of a license there. Like Aethelwald in the Last Kingdom, he's kind of a great rival to Alfred, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he attempts a coup or something. I think it was actually after Alfred died that Aethelwald kind of came back on the scene and you know, tried to claim the kingdom from Alfred's son Edward. So they've kind of conflated history a little bit there.
Yeah, I think we heard too that Ethelwald was probably actually just a little kid, maybe when Alfred came into power too, instead of being somebody who was old enough to be king, but was just, you know, not a good person or something. But
he wasn't a viable pretender to the throne, I think, particularly in that period, you know, when they needed someone. I mean, Alfred had combat experience, you know, and had led the army with his brothers. And I mean, they condense it down, obviously, but there were three brothers who ruled before him, you know, all with very short reigns. So he was the last of them, really, you know. He was the I think the story with Judith, it's because Alfred's brother married Judith, who was married to his father. So that's where they get the kind of the incest story. I think Alfred's biographer is a bit. He's very critical of that because it was scandalous, you know. But I think they've really run with it in Vikings, haven't they?
They love that Viking.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know if like one was more true than the other about how he came into power.
I think the Last Kingdom generally is more historically accurate, you know.
Yeah, that's what we found too. Yeah.
So yeah, he came to power when his brother died. Yeah.
In battle.
In the third season, you haven't seen that, but he reveals he's writing these chronicles about his time as king and the Danes and everything like that. Is that Brother Asser's work then? Is that what you've been saying?
Well, he gathered this kind of crack team around him, you know, of like he got scholars over from the continent, from France and Asser was Welsh, you know, his biographer was Welsh. He got people from Mercia, you know, he kind of gathered anyone he could really to kind of kickstart this reform of learning. And I think the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles were probably part of that revival of learning, you know, whether instigated by Alfred or by those around him or by, you know, there was I suppose a desire to chronicle the movements of the Vikings as well, you know, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is quite interested in where they're going when they're not in England as well, you know, so what they're doing on the continent, how the Franks are dealing with the threat of the Vikings, you know, and Alfred, in one of the works he translates, which is Orosius's history against the pagans, but it's basically a history of Europe before Rome was Christianized. And Alfred inserts this little these two travelogues, from Norse traders who've come to his kingdom and told him about Norway and told him about the Baltic, and he inserts those stories about the places where the Vikings came from, into his history of the world. So he's really trying to understand his enemy as well, I think, and understand the threat that was posed. So I suppose Alfred and the kind of Ragnar figure from the Vikings, they're in some ways they're interesting because they're both curious about the other culture, or curious about their adversary. And Vikings, then they're generally never scornful, I think, of the cultures that they encounter, or very rarely. They're always trying to learn. They're shocked sometimes at what they find, or they find something hard to believe. Like in Lindisfarne, there are all these monks walking around without weapons, with all this treasure around
what
them.
the heck? They talk about that in Vikings, about like, why are they leaving their gold out on these tables? Like,
and that's often misinterpreted, I think, as a kind of a pagan hatred of Christians, but it was just, you've got these undefended places, monasteries and religious houses that are full of treasure that aren't defended. Once you're successful in raiding one of them, you're going to look out for them, and you're going to target them. So I think the idea of a kind of religious war is a very old-fashioned one now. But yeah, I forget where we started with that question.
No. But back
great.
to Ragnar though. You said that he's mostly fictional, but his sons are historically accurate. Could you maybe elaborate more on that and help clear that up then?
Yeah, well, his sons kind of enter into history as the leaders of the Great Heathen Army, and in Vikings and in some of the sources as well. It's said that this is revenge for the death of their father Ragnar, but whether there's some kind of distortion of history, some kind of truth there or not, is very hard to tell. But certainly Ivar, was the leader of the Great Army until he disappears at some point, and he may reappear in Ireland. He may have popped up there as and Uber
as Emar or something, I think, right?
Yeah.
He wrote,
Yeah, and he founded, there was an Ivar who founded a dynasty in Ireland, but whether it's the same figure or not is unclear. Ubba, Fitzurk, and Bjorn Ironside as well. There was a Bjorn who raided Spain, northern Spain, and sailed into the Mediterranean and overwintered in the south of France, and tried to attack Rome, but didn't reach it. So these figures, whether they were brothers or not is not clear. Whether Ragnar was their father, whether he existed isn't clear, but they all have some kind of historical basis, So I think the Great Heathen Army is like, it's tending to think about it as being this one army under one commander, that was very homogeneous, but I think it was probably more like a gathering together of lots of people with a vaguely similar purpose, with competing. They have the brothers competing with each other, right, in Vikings.
Yeah.
But I think there would have been lots of different factions within that Great Heathen Army, and it was always splitting off into different groups, and reforming, and Vikings were joining them from elsewhere, and it's a very complicated situation. I think that's hard to kind of track through the historical chronicles. But they did exist in some form, the sons of Ragnar. So yeah,
that's fascinating. It's just Ragnar Lothbrok is such a fascinating character, just in general, and I think it's even cooler that he might have existed, maybe, most likely not, but do you think there was somebody he was based on, maybe like just a great sea
like
king?
An amalgamation of people, even?
There was certainly a guy who raided Paris, and he was famous for hanging 111 prisoners, that he captured in a raid on an island in the Seine. And he went back to Denmark shortly afterwards and died from dysentery, according to one source at least. A colleague of mine has suggested that's where his nickname Lothbrok, which means kind of shaggy breeches, or she thinks that might be a very, very descriptive, allusion to his dysentery.
Goodness.
But then there's this kind of legend that builds up around that nickname as well, that he fought the dragon with this suit that he'd covered in tar and rolled in the sand with, which doesn't make any sense at all. But that was perhaps a later attempt to make sense of the nickname, which is hard to understand. So yeah, I'm sure there was a figure, but it's just whether it was the same Ragnar who appears in different sources, and how much of it is legend and how much of it is loosely based on history. But it's really clever to use that figure, as the premise for a show about the Viking period, because it gives you license. You can play with it in a way that you perhaps can't with Alfred and the leaders of the Great Heathen Army, because a lot more is known about that period of history. But Ragnar is kind of coming out of the mists of time, and
so it's kind of the perfect one.
Yeah.
Do you know who went to Lindisfarne then? Because that was a real incident, right?
It was, yeah. But it was like they'd conflated the chronology massively in Vikings.
Right.
Ragnar, I think the Ragnar I was talking about who raided Paris, who sailed up the Seine, that was in the mid 9th century, and the first raid on Lindisfarne, was at the end of the 8th century. So it's certainly Ragnar wasn't involved with the raid on Lindisfarne, and it's a bit of a liberty, I think, to say that there were a group of Vikings who suddenly discovered this land to the west, that was the British Isles. Like they knew about it, they'd been trading, there'd been connections for a long time before the raid on Lindisfarne happened. But certainly that would have been that seems to have marked a massive escalation suddenly in these raids across the North Sea. Very soon afterwards, the Vikings are popping up in Ireland, in the Scottish Isles, and raiding all over the coast of Britain. And
now, we had a recent guest on, plays a character in The Last Kingdom who's Irish, and he did a lot of research into his own character. So what kind of, he mentioned something about how Dublin was kind of a Viking trade center, or even maybe a slave trade center. Could you talk about the Irish history of Vikings a little bit too?
Yeah, well, Dublin became the kind of center not just of Viking Ireland, but of a Viking empire, really, in the Irish Sea and in the Scottish Isles and Orkney, Shetland, involving Norway as well. And Dublin was the center of the slave trade. It was clearly a really, really important center. Like the Vikings in Ireland, it was a bit different to the way they operated, I suppose, or the history that developed in England. They never conquered Ireland. They had land around Dublin that they controlled. They founded trading posts. Cork, where I'm sitting right now, was a Viking fort. Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, but they didn't kind of control the interior. They were more interested in setting up these kind of outward-facing trading areas, I suppose, that had a symbiotic relationship with the Irish and with the kind of agricultural society around them. But they were facing out into the Irish Sea, and they were centers of trade and of places where raids were organized against England, so quite a different history developed. But yeah, I haven't got that far in Vikings to the Irish aspect of it yet, but I really need to, because
do they go into Ireland in Vikings? I can't remember.
Oh no. Last Kingdom.
Last.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the Last King, there's a character that appears in season 2. They don't go to Ireland or anything, but we kind of just hear about Ireland. They
Mhm.
make reference to it several times about how Ivar died there. That's why Ubba had to leave at one point. And
Sigtryggr is from there.
Sigtryggr is a new character in the Last Kingdom in the show that just appeared from Dublin as well. So, but we just had one of those the actors on, and he told us about Dublin having the rich Viking history. It's not something that we think about with Dublin.
No. I mean, if you go there, they have these kind of Viking tours, where everyone is wearing a horned helmet and shouting as they're driven around the city and things. So it's hard to miss its Viking heritage. Yeah. But yeah, it's I mean, it was perfectly located, I suppose, because it's slap bang in the middle of the Irish Sea. It's facing Scotland, Wales, England, like easy passage to the north and to the south to wherever the Vikings wanted to go, really. So
yeah, it's something we're learning more. It's not all clear cut. These are the Vikings, the Scandinavians. Here's the Saxons. It's there was British people there. Saxons came in. Vikings came in. Everyone's been murdering and marrying each other for hundreds of years and just blending it up.
Yeah, and that's another thing that they do really well, I think, in those series is they don't draw too rigid a line, between these different cultures and different peoples. There's a lot of the Danes quickly assimilated in England, and became Christian, and then would have fought against other Vikings, and then there was all this kind of interplay, and the Irish were raiding monasteries before the Vikings even got there, and I think that image of Alfred kind of drawing on all the learned people he could get from around Europe, it kind of speaks to the ties that there were, particularly amongst medieval Christianity, early medieval Christianity, and the church of being able to draw from across Europe, to reform the literature and the language in the way that he did.
Wow. It's amazing. And then Aethelflead too is something that's covered in Last Kingdom that is like she should be talked about way more, I feel like, in history.
Yeah. There's a good documentary actually that was on the BBC not too long ago about Aethelflaed and her importance, as a figure in Mercia, but in England as well, in kind of that crucial period after Alfred passed, and it could have passed on to her daughter as well, if history had been a little different. But no, I think that's she's been overlooked quite a lot in the past. So it's great to see. I know. Well, I haven't watched it this far, but I know that she comes in the Last Kingdom as well, doesn't she? She plays.
Yeah, this last season they did the Battle of Tetton Hall, and covered that and had her and Edward kind of teaming up, which was pretty cool. It's cool to learn about these stories. They're just amazing stories in the Norse myths. Really fascinating tales.
One thing we always like to talk about on here is our shows, our favorite books and movies and things like that. What are some of your favorite things to watch or to even read or anything like that?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one. What have I been watching recently? I've been watching quite a lot of trash actually with the lockdown being on.
Yeah.
No, I have enjoyed watching Vikings. Like that's something I've been meaning to watch for a long time, and I kind of settled down to it during the lockdown. Like I know a lot of people have got these backlogs of things that they wanted to watch.
Yeah.
You probably have a unique take when watching it, knowing a lot of these stories by heart already, and then kind of seeing them after the fact, where we were knowing nothing about it and learning about them.
Yeah. So it's been nice for that. But what other shows have I been watching? You've caught me with that question. Actually, I can't.
I'm sorry. Are you a fan of the Marvel movies in that though too? Do you stay?
Yeah, I particularly like the Thor Ragnarok. I thought that was really funny actually. And
it was. Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other discussion, right, about Marvel and what they've done with the myths and things. But yeah,
they're British. They're all British now.
Yeah,
they're not Scandinavians.
Yeah, true. That's an interesting thing. Yeah, Loki. He's become a kind of a bit of a cultural icon, hasn't he? The local figure in Marvel. But,
he seems kind of true, though, to the myth, though, to me, though. At least I'm just like, he seems pretty consistent with what I read and hear to what's up on there.
Yeah, he's sly and he's handsome and he's devious. Like, yeah, I think they've got a lot of things right. And Thor as well. You know, he has his moments when he's, you know, his strength is is better than his brains.
That's true.
Especially in Ragnarok. He tosses brains out the window.
Yeah, exactly.
So we really enjoyed this book, reading from you, the Norse gods and myths retold.
Thanks so much.
Do you have any other books coming up? Anything else lined up that you plan on writing?
Well, I'm working on a children's version of the myths at the moment.
Very cool.
So it's
very
cool. Very early stages, but an illustrated version. So yeah, that was the kind of lockdown project.
That's interesting.
It's something I need to settle down to is to reading Bernard Cornwell as well. Bit of a travesty that I haven't read those books.
Yeah, they're fascinating. He stays, you know, more so than the show too, to the history as well. And I like at the end of all his books, he kind of tells what he had to change from the history to make it fit the story of the book, which is pretty cool.
I've heard very good things, and he's clearly done his research, you know. And I don't know what you think of Neil Gaiman's Norse myths, but
I took a look at it. They're good. It seems like he does kind of take liberty to tell his own story sometimes.
Yeah, which is good. I think it's you can really hear his voice in it, you know. And I like the fact that he treats them very much as kind of these everyday figures. You know, he uses very kind of informal language, and you know, he doesn't put them on a pedestal. I think he lost some of the seriousness of some of the myths. You know, the kind of the big dramatic cosmic things. He kind of downplays them a little bit. But I think it's a really good retelling as well. You know, it's it's cool. Well, it'll be interesting. Popular, yeah.
Well, I feel like one of the challenges might be how to make a children's book out of some of these stories too, with just some of how graphic they are.
I know. That's something I'll have to be negotiating with the publisher, I think.
Or just knocked them out, made them go to sleep.
Yeah. Well, some of them they'd love. You know, there's a lot of toilet humor and crazy things happening. But yeah, we'll see how it turns out.
Well, you'll have to let us know too if that comes out, and we'd love to check that out. Even though it would be geared toward children, it'd probably be super cool for adults to read as well.
Yeah. When I'm reading it, sometimes I'm just like, how would I retell these now that I know them to like a child or something like that? I've been thinking about that, so I think that'll be really cool to check out.
Yeah. Well, you should.
Yeah, definitely.
Taking them all in, give them a different take.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It was good to chat.
We'll have all of his books linked down to below in the description.
Yeah, if you want to learn about the myths, you want to learn about the history intertwined with the myths, this is a great book to check out, the Norse myths. And by the way, we didn't really talk about it much, but I really love how you bring in the art that was created from it too. I did want to mention real quick, I love the, I don't remember what page it's on, but the painting of King Ela being told that the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok are coming.
Yeah,
it's one of my favorites just because he just looks so sad sitting on his throne thinking of what might happen.
Oh, damn moment. There's some great artwork in that book. There's the paperback version as well. I haven't got the hardback. I've got all my copies of that, but I've got the little paperback here. So.
Oh, okay. Thank you again for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening in. Make sure to check out the links we have down below. Make sure to follow us on podcasts or subscribe on YouTube, and follow us all on social media and everything too. And we'll have all of Dr. Tom Birkett's stuff linked down below, so check that out. But thanks again.
Yeah.